Usually when we talk about a medical diagnosis, there is this very comforting expectation of precision.
Right.
Like it feels almost like engineering.
Yeah, absolutely. It's very mechanical.
Right. If you take a bad fall on a ski slope and, your arm swells up, you go get an x-ray.
Mm-hmm.
And the image comes back and you see that jagged, glowing white line across the radius bone. And the doctor just points at the screen and says, well, there it is. That is the problem. It's entirely binary.
It's either broken or it isn't.
Exactly.
And I mean, that binary gives us a really profound sense of psychological security.
Yeah.
We inherently crave a reality where problems are, visible, neatly categorized, and therefore solvable with just a standard cast and 6 weeks of rest.
Right. But then you step into the realm of international relations and you realize almost immediately that the x-ray machine is fundamentally broken. Or, well, maybe it was just never plugged in to begin with.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it.
We are looking at this global diagnostic landscape that just isn't a neat fracture. It's murky, it's chaotic, and it's overflowing with contradictory symptoms. I mean, we're watching wars break out, trade agreements collapse, historical alliances fracture, and there's no single diagnostic tool that can just, point to the screen and say, yes, here's the clean break in the international system.
No, it is the absolute definition of diagnostic muddy waters. The daily flow of global news is just a barrage of seemingly random, often terrifying, and deeply complex events. And without a framework to process that information, it just looks like noise.
Which brings us to the core of our discussion today. For those of you joining us for this fourth deep dive in our summer series on diplomacy and international relations, we are tackling a question that sits beneath every single news headline you read. With all this chaotic flow of daily events, why do we actually need theory to make sense of international politics? If you've been with us for the first 3 deep dives, we've laid some serious groundwork. We've traced the sweeping history of the modern world, unpacked the intricate, often hidden mechanics of diplomacy, and mapped out the massive cast of actors operating on the world stage.
Yeah, we covered a lot of ground.
It really did. But today, we are talking about the toolkit you need to actually interpret how all those actors collide. Oh, and real quick, before we get into it, if you're enjoying this series, make sure to follow and subscribe. And, if you want to help keep the show running, check out our Patreon. The link is in the description.
Yeah, and subscribing there grants you access to extra deep dives, plus our exclusive weekly and monthly briefings that are specifically focused on Danish politics, which is super helpful for applying these big ideas locally.
Exactly. So, okay, back to theory. How do we even begin to define what theory is in this context?
Well, I like to think of theory as the operating system for your geopolitical brain.
Okay, I like that.
Because if you try to process every single diplomatic cable, every military movement, every economic shift as just raw data, you will crash. Theory gives you the algorithm to filter the noise and find the signal.
Yeah, I often visualize it like a set of prescription glasses or maybe different camera filters on your phone.
Oh, that's a good analogy.
Right. Like you take a photo of a crowded city street. That is the raw data, the actual event. Now, if you apply a high contrast black and white filter, the image suddenly looks gritty, dangerous, bleak. Your eyes are drawn to the shadows and the isolation of the figures. But if you swipe and apply a warm, vintage golden hour filter to the exact same photo, it suddenly looks cooperative, nostalgic, community-oriented.
Yeah, your focus totally shifts.
Exactly. Your eyes are drawn to the people talking on the corner. The underlying picture hasn't changed by a single pixel, but the filter completely changes the focal point and the story you tell about that street.
That is a phenomenal way to conceptualize it. The filter dictates the narrative. And our goal today, using some highly comprehensive academic source material on international relations theory, is to basically hand you those different filters.
Right.
We want to show you how applying these different theoretical lenses completely alters your understanding of the exact same global events.
And I want to pause here because looking through the sources, the first major hurdle for anyone getting into this is just understanding what we actually mean by theory in this context.
Yeah, it can be intimidating.
It really can. And the literature draws a very hard line between 2 types of theory, right? Empirical and normative. Let's break those down.
Yeah, this distinction is crucial because it dictates the entire purpose of your analysis. So an empirical theory is strictly observational. It attempts to explain the world based on measurable historical experiences.
So it's looking at what's already there.
Exactly. It is trying to describe how the world actually is. An empirical theorist will look at, say, a trade war and attempt to measure the tangible material factors.
Like tariffs or supply chain disruptions, that sort of thing.
Right, tariffs, domestic employment rates, things that caused it, they are looking purely for cause and effect.
Okay, so that's like the scientists just measuring the temperature of the water.
Exactly.
But then the normative theory comes in, and this feels, I don't know, much more like philosophy to me. Normative theories build on principles of how social interactions ought to be.
Yes,
They are prescriptive, not just descriptive.
that's right. Normative theorists look at the international system and they evaluate it against a moral baseline. They might say, well, based on the universal value of human rights, this is the direction the international system should be moving.
Okay.
And here is how we engineer the institutions to actually get us there.
Which perfectly explains why debates in international relations get so incredibly heated.
Oh, completely.
I mean, if I'm operating on an empirical level, just arguing about the math of a missile trajectory, and you are operating on a normative level, arguing about the morality of possessing the missile at all, we aren't even having the same conversation.
No, you're talking past each other. And this is exactly why stepping into theory requires what the literature calls a paradigm shift.
Right. Thomas Kuhn's concept.
Yes, Thomas Kuhn. His concept of the paradigm shift is foundational here. A paradigm is basically the accepted framework of basic concepts, assumptions, and practices within any discipline. Kuhn argued that scientific progress isn't just this slow, steady accumulation of facts. It happens in violent ruptures.
The classic example being the shift from a geocentric universe where everyone absolutely knew the sun revolved around the Earth to a heliocentric universe.
Obviously.
Because you can't just take the new data about the Earth moving and comfortably wedge it into your old Earth-centered model. The math literally breaks.
It doesn't work.
You have to throw the entire old model out and start from scratch.
And that process is deeply disorienting. I mean, it forces you to question your own fundamental baseline of reality. When you adopt a new theoretical paradigm in international relations, the actors change, the motives change, the definition of power changes.
Wow.
You are looking at the exact same planet, but the mechanics of how it operates have flipped.
But, okay, if these theories are just different filters, a way of managing data, I have a major reservation here.
Okay, what is it?
Looking at how political science is often practiced, doesn't picking a single filter and rigidly defending it create a massive blind spot?
Oh, definitely.
Because the sources warn about something called vertical drift.
Right.
If I decide I'm a strict believer in one theory, won't I just cherry-pick facts from the individual level, the state level, or the global level just to prove my filter is the right one while ignoring all the contradictory data?
Yeah, you've identified the great trap of academia right there. Vertical drift is a pervasive issue. It happens when an analyst lacks a disciplined framework and just randomly pulls facts from different levels of analysis to justify a pre-existing conclusion.
Right.
However, theorists often fiercely defend their single paradigm because switching filters mid-analysis destroys your logical consistency. Well, if you explain the outbreak of a war using the logic of, say, power competition, but then you try to explain the peace treaty using the logic of innate human goodness, your analysis just falls apart.
Oh, I see. It's internally inconsistent.
Exactly. A robust theory provides a rigid framework to test against reality. The best thinkers don't abandon their filter, they simply acknowledge its blind spots.
All right, well, I want to start testing these frameworks against reality. The literature spends a significant amount of time on the two titans of mainstream IR theory.
Liberalism and realism.
Exactly. These are the foundational paradigms that practically define the 20th century.
Right.
I want to start with liberalism because, honestly, reading its core tenets, it feels surprisingly optimistic for a discipline focused on geopolitics.
It is fundamentally optimistic. Liberalism in international relations operates on a very specific premise regarding human nature. It argues that humans are either innately good or, at the very least, capable of profound rational cooperation. Therefore, a lasting structural peace is not just some utopian dream. It is actually an achievable mechanical goal.
And to understand the mechanics of this, the sources point us all the way back to the late 18th century, to the philosopher Immanuel Kant.
Yes, Kant is essential here.
Kant laid the groundwork for what we now refer to as democratic peace theory. And I found the logic here incredibly compelling. Kant essentially argued that the internal structure of a state dictates its external behavior. If you have a liberal democratic state, The citizens are the ones holding the power.
And crucially, the citizens are the ones who bear the physical and economic costs of war.
Right.
They're the ones getting drafted. They're the ones paying the taxes to fund the military.
Exactly. So Kant's mechanistic argument is that if the people paying the blood price are actually in charge of the government through voting, they will rationally choose to avoid war.
Because it hurts them directly.
Yes. Therefore, if you can foster a world populated entirely by liberal democracies, they will inherently avoid going to war with each other.
It is a profound shift from the reality of 18th century Europe. I mean, back then, Europe was dominated by monarchs who could launch devastating territorial wars purely for personal glory.
And they were completely insulated from the suffering of their subjects.
Exactly. Liberalism suggests that democratization is the ultimate engine for global peace. Furthermore, liberals really emphasize economic interdependence.
Like trade and supply chains.
Yeah. If two democratic nations have deeply intertwined economies, if they rely on each other for energy, technology, consumer goods, the financial cost of going to war becomes utterly ruinous for both sides. War basically becomes economically irrational.
We saw this theoretical optimism really attempt to manifest physically after the catastrophic trauma of First World War.
Yes, we did.
When you look at the devastation of trench warfare, the liberal response was, look, we must engineer a system where this never happens again. And that brings us to U.S. President Woodrow Wilson and the creation of the League of Nations.
The League of Nations was the ultimate normative liberal project. Wilson's vision was to replace the old, secretive alliances of European empires with a transparent, general association of nations.
Right.
The mechanism there was collective security. The idea was that all nations would agree to respect each other's territorial integrity.
Sounds great on paper.
Right. And if one nation became an aggressor, the entire rest of the international community would automatically unite to punish them economically or militarily.
But the architecture of that project failed spectacularly. I mean, the League couldn't stop Japan from invading Manchuria. It couldn't stop Italy from invading Ethiopia. And it completely failed to prevent the rise of Nazi Germany and the outbreak of the Second World War.
Completely failed.
When I look at that failure, it seems like the liberal assumption of rational cooperation just completely collapsed under the weight of aggressive nationalism. If human beings are capable of engineering the Holocaust, how does liberal theory survive?
Historically, in that specific moment, it didn't. The trauma of the Second World War shattered the dominance of liberal optimism in international relations.
It just couldn't explain what happened.
No, it couldn't. The failure of the League of Nations created a massive intellectual vacuum. Policymakers and scholars looked at the wreckage of Europe and realized that relying on the innate goodness of humanity or the deterrent power of international law was not just naive, it was lethally dangerous. And filling that vacuum was the reactionary, hard-nosed paradigm of realism.
Okay, so if liberalism is that warm, golden hour filter focusing on shared prosperity, realism is the high contrast, black and white lens that just strips away all illusions.
Yes, absolutely.
It is cynical, it is gritty, and it views the international arena as a brutal arena of survival.
Realism fundamentally rejects the liberal premise of human nature. Drawing on the political philosophy of Thomas Hobbes, realists view human beings as inherently self-interested, fearful, and driven by a desire for power. Hobbes described the hypothetical state of nature, a world before governments and laws, as a war of all against all, where life is nasty, brutish, and short.
And the realist leap here is really fascinating. They say, look, we solved the Hobbesian state of nature inside our borders by creating a sovereign government, right, a monopoly on violence that enforces the law. But outside our borders, the realist argument is that the international system is currently stuck in that brutal state of nature.
This is the defining concept of realism, which is international anarchy. Now, it's vital to understand that in IR theory, anarchy doesn't mean chaos or constant explosions.
Okay, what does it mean?
Anarchy has a very specific structural definition. It simply means there is no overarching global sovereign. There is no world government, no ultimate police force. If a hostile nation rolls tanks across your border, there is no global 911 you can call that is guaranteed to save you.
Because even the UN, as we'll discuss later, doesn't have its own standing army. It relies entirely on the voluntary contributions of self-interested states.
Exactly.
So, if we accept this premise of anarchy, the downstream effects are massive. Hans Morgenthau, one of the foundational thinkers of 20th century realism, argued that because of this anarchic environment, all politics is a struggle for power.
It is a tragic, inescapable logic. In an anarchic system, your ultimate goal is simply survival. because you can never truly know the hidden intentions of your neighboring state. I mean, they might seem friendly today, but leadership changes, right?
Sure.
The only way to guarantee your survival is to accumulate more power than they have. You must build a stronger military, secure more resources, form strategic alliances.
But wait, this creates a terrifying feedback loop. Let's look at the mechanics of this. Say I'm a state and I feel insecure, so I build 10 new warships.
Right.
My intention is purely defensive. I just want to protect my coastline.
Okay.
But my neighbor sees those 10 warships and thinks, wait, are they planning to attack me?
Naturally.
Aye. So to guarantee their survival, they build 12 warships. Now I feel incredibly threatened, so I build 20. Neither of us wanted a war, but the structure of anarchy forced us into a massive arms race.
What you've just described is the security dilemma, and it is the beating heart of realist theory. It explains how rational, security-seeking actions by one state inherently decrease the security of another, leading to spiraling tensions.
Like the Cold War.
Perfectly. It perfectly explains the logic of the U.S.-Soviet nuclear arms race during the Cold War. The tragedy of realism is that states are trapped in this cycle, regardless of their internal domestic politics.
Okay, I understand the internal logic, but I have to push back here.
Sure.
Realism paints a picture of a perpetual paranoid cage match. It sounds like a geopolitical reality show where everyone is just sharpening knives behind their backs.
A little bit, yeah.
But if you look at the empirical data of the last 70 years, we haven't had a World War III. We have long, sustained periods of peace, massive global trade, and really complex diplomatic cooperation. How do realists justify their grim worldview when we are clearly capable of putting the knives down?
Well, a realist would smile at that and say you are fundamentally misinterpreting the nature of peace. For a realist, peace is not an evolution of human morality, nor is it the triumph of international law. Peace is simply a balance of power.
A temporary stalemate.
Precisely. If two rival alliances are relatively equal in military and economic strength like NATO and the Warsaw Pact during the Cold War, they will not directly attack each other because the cost of doing so is mutual destruction.
Right.
The peace you are experiencing is merely a pause. It's a period where states are consolidating resources and maneuvering for advantage.
Wow.
The moment that balance of power shifts, if one side develops a revolutionary new weapon or suffers an internal collapse, the systemic restraint vanishes and conflict becomes highly probable.
So liberalism argues we are slowly building a permanent architecture of peace, while realism argues we are just catching our breath between inevitable wars.
Pretty much.
That is an enormous analytical chasm. Surely in the decades since these theories were formulated, someone has tried to find a middle ground.
Yes, definitely. The rigid dichotomy between the liberal focus on institutions and the realist obsession with raw power left a lot of scholars dissatisfied. And this dissatisfaction birthed two incredibly important frameworks, the English school and constructivism.
Let's unpack the English school first, because it introduces a concept that sounds like a total oxymoron.
Oh.
The anarchical society, popularized by Hedley Bull. How can you have a society if you've already conceded to the realists that the system is anarchic?
Bull's intervention is brilliant because he accepts the realist premise. Yes, there is no global police force. The system is anarchic.
Okay.
However, he rejects the realist conclusion that anarchy inevitably results in a brutal Hobbesian war of all against all. Bull observed that states, over centuries of interaction, have formed a distinct international society.
Sounds like a gentleman's club without a bouncer.
Exactly. Even without an enforcer, states generally follow established rules. They respect diplomatic immunity. They don't generally assassinate each other's ambassadors.
Right.
They negotiate treaties and usually adhere to them. They recognize each other's borders and sovereignty. Why? Not just because they are terrified of retaliation, but because it is mutually beneficial to have predictable rules of the game. They have formed a shared diplomatic culture.
So the English school tempers the paranoia of realism with the practical cooperative habits of liberalism. It's a very pragmatic middle ground.
It is.
But if we want to talk about how those habits are actually formed, we have to talk about constructivism. And this is where the theory gets profoundly interesting, because it moves away from material things like tanks and GDP and focuses entirely on the realm of human ideas.
Constructivism is a true paradigm shift. The foundational quote here belongs to Alexander Wendt, who famously wrote, "Anarchy is what states make of it."
I love that quote.
It's a great one. Realists treat anarchy like gravity, an inescapable material law of the universe that forces states to compete for power. Wendt argues that anarchy is empty. It has no inherent logic.
Right, his argument is that if states are constantly preparing for war, it isn't because the system forced them to, it's because they constructed a culture of enmity.
Exactly.
Let's dive into the mechanics of constructivism. It argues that state identities, and therefore state interests, are socially constructed by shared ideas, norms, and historical interactions.
Let me give you a really concrete example. The United States has a massive nuclear arsenal. The United Kingdom has a smaller, but highly lethal nuclear arsenal. North Korea has a relatively tiny nuclear arsenal.
Okay.
A strict realist, looking only at material power, would say the U.S. should be terrified of the U.K.'s hundreds of warheads and barely concerned about North Korea's handful.
But the reality is the exact opposite. The U.S. doesn't lose a second of sleep over British nukes, but views North Korean nukes as an existential crisis.
Why? Because of shared ideas and identity. The U.S. and the U.K. have a shared history, democratic norms, and a constructed identity as allies. Their interaction is based on trust. The U.S. and North Korea have a constructed history of enmity. Constructivists point out that material power means nothing without the social context that gives it meaning.
And the deeply optimistic, almost revolutionary mechanic of constructivism is that if our reality is constructed by shared norms, then we are not trapped.
Exactly.
If the rules of the game are just ideas we all agreed upon, a critical mass of people could simply change their minds. We could construct a new norm. Look at formal imperialism. 150 years ago, conquering another nation and stealing its resources was a globally accepted norm of statecraft.
It was standard practice.
Today, it is a profound violation of international norms. The material world didn't change, our ideas did.
That is the power of constructivism, but, it also opens a critical doorway. If reality is constructed by the dominant norms and ideas, we have to ask whose ideas?
Right.
Who got to write the rules of this international society?
Yeah.
And who was excluded from the room when those identities were being constructed?
Which brings us perfectly into the realm of critical and alternative theories.
Yeah.
Because if you look at mainstream IR realism, liberalism, even constructivism to an extent, it was largely built by white, Western male scholars analyzing the actions of powerful, industrialized Western states.
Yeah.
Critical theories argue that this incredibly narrow lens actively hides massive structures of oppression.
Critical theories share a unifying mission. They do not just want to explain the world as it is. They want to expose the hidden power dynamics of the system to emancipate the people crushed by it. They challenge the foundational assumptions we've been taking for granted. Let's begin with Marxism.
Now, when most people hear Marxism, they immediately think of domestic politics. Unions, taxation, the Bolshevik Revolution.
Sure.
But applying a Marxist lens to international relations entirely redraws the map. Mainstream theories are obsessed with the state as the primary actor. Marxism looks at the geopolitical map, takes an eraser to all the national borders, and redraws the world strictly along class lines.
Yes. For a Marxist, the fundamental dividing line of humanity is not between the French and the Germans, or the Americans and the Chinese. The dividing line is between the bourgeoisie, the owners of capital and the means of production, and the proletariat, the working class who must sell their labor to survive.
So when a realist looks at the expansion of an empire, they see a state maximizing its security.
Yeah.
How does a Marxist mechanistically explain imperialism?
Well, a Marxist views imperialism and the entire international state system as a mechanism for capital accumulation.
Yep.
As industrialized economies produce more goods than their domestic populations can consume, and as the rate of profit begins to fall at home, the capitalist class must expand outward. They use the machinery of the state, the military, to forcibly open new markets, extract cheap raw materials from the developing world, and exploit foreign labor.
So a Marxist would argue that a war between two nations isn't a tragic security dilemma. It is an engineered conflict where the wealthy elite in country A send the working poor of country A to slaughter the working poor of country B just to secure control over an oil field or a vital shipping lane, which just ends up enriching the elites of both nations.
Exactly.
The state is just a shell company for the bourgeoisie.
That's a great way to put it. And this leads into dependency theory, which is a crucial branch of Marxist IR. It argues that the global economy is structurally rigged.
How so?
You have the core, wealthy, industrialized nations and the periphery, developing nations. The core extracts cheap raw materials from the periphery, manufactures them into high-value technology, and sells them back to the periphery. The periphery is structurally trapped in a cycle of debt and underdevelopment, constantly feeding the wealth of the core.
Which flows seamlessly into our next critical framework, post-colonialism. If Marxism focuses on class, Post-colonialism zeroes in on the lingering structural legacy of empire and race. It forces us to confront the reality that the international system wasn't formed by a bunch of equal states politely signing treaties. It was forged through brutal global colonization.
The sources highlight the profound impact of Edward Said's concept of Orientalism here. Said demonstrated how Western scholars, writers, and politicians systematically constructed a false, generalized narrative about the Middle East and Asia.
Right.
The Orient was depicted as exotic, backward, irrational, and inherently dangerous.
While the West constructed its own identity as rational, progressive, and civilized.
Exactly. And this wasn't just bad literature, it was a mechanism of power. By establishing themselves as the rational adult in the room, Western empires legitimized their domination over the supposedly irrational, childlike East. Post-colonialism points out that this dynamic didn't just evaporate when colonies gained formal independence.
Right. I mean, look at how national borders were drawn in the Middle East and Africa. Lines were drawn on maps by British and French diplomats in drawing rooms, completely ignoring complex ethnic, linguistic, and historical realities on the ground.
Oh, absolutely.
A post-colonialist points out that when we analyze a modern civil war in one of these regions, a realist might just see a failed state. But a post-colonialist forces you to see the direct, mechanistic result of artificial colonial borders designed to divide and rule.
Yes.
It demands that the voices of the global South are centered in our analysis, rather than being treated merely as the battlegrounds for great power competition.
And if we are talking about marginalized voices, we absolutely must engage with feminist IR theory. Feminist theorists in the 1980s, like Cynthia Enloe, started asking a deceptively simple question that shattered the discipline.
Which was?
Where are the women? When you look at the summits, the defense ministries, and the UN Security Council, the actors making the decisions that shape the globe are overwhelmingly men.
But the feminist critique goes far beyond just demanding a quota of women in the boardroom. Right.
Yeah.
It attacked the very conceptual foundation of IR. The sources bring up V. Spike Peterson's concept of gender invisibility. Feminist theory argues that the core concepts of international relations, rationality, power, and especially security, are fundamentally defined by masculine traits.
Let's dissect the concept of security as an example. When a realist talks about national security, they are talking mechanistically about protecting the borders of the state from foreign military invasion. They measure security in fighter jets and missile defense systems.
But feminist scholars argue this is a profoundly narrow, masculine definition of security. If a state has impenetrable borders and a massive army, the realist says the state is secure.
Right.
But what if, within those borders, domestic violence rates are skyrocketing, women lack basic economic autonomy, and maternal mortality is soaring? From a human security perspective, half the population is intensely insecure.
Feminism reveals that the state itself is not a neutral protector. It often enforces patriarchal structures that disproportionately harm women. Furthermore, in times of war, mainstream analysis focuses on the battlefield.
Right. Troop movements and casualties.
Yeah, exactly. But feminist analysis brings visibility to the hidden economy of war. The exploitation of female labor to sustain the war effort, the use of sexual violence as a systematic weapon of ethnic cleansing, and the burden placed on women as refugees keeping families alive. By making gender visible, you realize the entire architecture of global politics is skewed.
Okay, we have one final critical theory to explore, and I will admit, this is the one that bends my brain the most.
Post-structuralism.
Post-structuralism. This framework takes aim at the very language we use to construct reality. They utilize the philosopher Jacques Derrida's concept of deconstruction.
Yeah, post-structuralism argues that there is no objective truth outside of discourse. The language we use doesn't just describe reality, it creates it.
Okay, that's heavy.
They look at binary oppositions, good versus evil, developed versus underdeveloped, civilized versus barbaric, and show how these linguistic pairings are always hierarchical. One term is always dominant, and the powerful use this language to legitimize their actions.
Let me try to break this down mechanically with a concrete example. Let's look at military language. When a Western military drops a bomb that accidentally kills a family in a war zone, the military press briefing refers to it as collateral damage.
A textbook example of discourse.
When you deconstruct that phrase, collateral damage sounds clinical, mathematical, unavoidable. It sounds like an accounting error. But if an insurgent group detonates a bomb that kills a family, the press calls it a barbaric slaughter of innocent civilians. The physical reality on the ground is identical. A family is dead. But the discourse completely shifts the moral responsibility. The language of collateral damage sanitizes state violence and maintains the state's legitimacy, while the language of barbarism delegitimizes the non-state actor.
That is exactly how deconstruction works. It exposes how language is weaponized.
Okay, but here's my major pushback. I completely understand the intellectual exercise of deconstructing a press briefing. But how does this accomplish anything practical in the brutal reality of global politics?
It's a fair question.
If a hostile nation has amassed 100,000 troops on your border and their tanks are rolling forward, deconstructing the linguistic origins of the word sovereignty isn't going to stop the tank treads. Isn't this just academic wordplay while Rome burns?
It is the most common and potent critique of post-structuralism. It can feel deeply detached from material urgency. But the counter-argument is that you cannot fight a system of power until you understand how it justifies itself.
What do you mean?
Dictators don't just roll tanks, they construct elaborate historical and linguistic narratives to justify why those tanks belong there. Claiming historical sovereignty, or framing the invasion as a peacekeeping operation to protect ethnic minorities.
Right, controlling the narrative.
If you can dismantle the language they use to justify the violence, you strip away their domestic and international legitimacy. You make it vastly easier for the international community to unite against them with sanctions and support for the victim. You don't stop the tank with a dictionary, but you shatter the narrative that allows the tank to operate unopposed.
That makes a lot of sense. It is about breaking the spell of propaganda. Okay, we have laid out an incredible array of lenses today. Liberalism, realism, the English school, constructivism, Marxism, post-colonialism, feminism, and post-structuralism.
It's a full toolbox.
Now, I want to take these abstract concepts and anchor them to physical brick and mortar. Let's apply these theories to the most prominent institution in global politics, the United Nations, specifically the UN Security Council.
The UN Security Council is the ultimate crucible for IR theory. To set the baseline, the Council has 15 members, but the true geopolitical gravity lies with the 5 permanent members, the US, Russia, China, France, and the UK.
Right.
And crucially, each of these 5 holds an absolute veto power over any substantive resolution.
Which essentially freezes the power dynamics of 1945 in amber. Let's walk into the UN building and look through our different theoretical windows. If I put on my liberal glasses, how do I interpret this institution?
A liberal looks at the UN and sees the greatest triumph of institutionalized diplomacy in human history. They don't pretend it's perfect, but they see a vital forum where states can resolve disputes through dialogue rather than artillery. The very existence of the UN creates a habit of cooperation. It establishes international law, and it coordinates massive logistical efforts for human rights and global health.
Okay, I take the liberal glasses off and snap on my realist lenses. The warm glow of cooperation vanishes. How does a realist explain the UN Security Council?
A realist looks at the UN and sees a theater where hard power goes to put on a suit. They argue that the UN only functions when its actions align perfectly with the national interests of the great powers.
So the veto is central for them.
Absolutely. To a realist, the veto power isn't a flaw in the system. It is the only reason the great powers agreed to show up in the first place. The veto guarantees they can never be restrained by the majority.
And the defining historical proof of this is the 2003 U.S. invasion of Iraq. The U.S. went to the Security Council, asked for authorization to invade, and failed to get it. And what did the U.S. do? It simply bypassed the UN and invaded anyway, along with a coalition of the willing.
Exactly.
The realist points to that and says, see, when push comes to shove, material military power completely ignores international institutions.
But if we swap to constructivist glasses and look at that exact same 2003 invasion, the analysis shifts entirely.
How so?
A constructivist agrees the U.S. bypassed the UN, but they focus on the cost of doing so. Because the UN holds immense normative power, the idea that the UN confers international legitimacy, bypassing it severely damaged American soft power.
Oh, interesting.
It alienated allies, fueled global anti-American sentiment, and made the subsequent occupation vastly more difficult. The U.S. proved it had the hard power to ignore the UN, but the constructivist points out a massive reputational damage of violating a global norm.
That is a brilliant distinction. Let's keep moving. If I put on my Marxist glasses, I look at the UN and see a capitalist management committee. It's a forum for the core wealthy states to manage the global economy, regulate trade to their advantage, and occasionally dispense humanitarian aid to the periphery just to prevent a total proletarian revolution that would disrupt global supply chains.
Spot on. And if you view it through a feminist lens, you look at the history of the Security Council, the body authorized to dictate global security, and see an institution that has been almost exclusively run by men.
Right.
You analyze UN peacekeeping missions and question why traditional mandates focus purely on separating armies, while entirely ignoring the epidemic of sexual violence against women in those conflict zones, treating it as a secondary domestic issue rather than a core security threat.
And finally, a post-colonialist walks into the Security Council chamber, looks at the 5 permanent, veto-wielding members, and points out a staggering geographical and racial reality. There is no permanent representation for the entire continent of Africa, nor for Latin America, nor for India, which represents over 1 billion people.
It's glaring.
A post-colonialist sees an archaic structure designed to perpetuate the global hegemony of the former colonial powers, keeping the global South in a state of permanent political subordination.
It is genuinely remarkable. By simply changing your theoretical lens, the United Nations transfers from a beacon of hope to a cynical tool of power, to a theater of norms, to a mechanism of gendered and colonial oppression. None of these lenses are lying. They are just illuminating different structural realities.
It proves beyond a shadow of a doubt why you cannot rely on just one theory. And to bring this home, I want to move out of the classroom and into the war room.
Okay, let's do it.
I want to put this to a practical test. Let's do a thought experiment. Imagine you are sitting in Christiansburg Palace, advising the Danish Prime Minister. A crisis has just broken out. A highly radicalized transnational terrorist group has seized significant territory in a fragile state in North Africa, relatively close to the borders of the European Union.
Okay, serious situation.
This is triggering a massive wave of displaced persons moving toward the Mediterranean, and there is intelligence suggesting the group plans to strike European targets. Walk me through how you brief the Prime Minister on this exact same scenario, first using a realist lens and then a constructivist lens.
It is a highly complex, very realistic scenario. Let's start with the realist briefing. I walk into the Prime Minister's office, and my sole focus is the material security of the Danish state and the stability of the European balance of power. I define the terrorist group strictly as a kinetic, physical threat to our borders.
So purely a military problem.
Yes. My briefing explains that the fragile North African state has lost its monopoly on violence, creating a power vacuum that threatens regional stability. My recommendation is entirely reliant on hard power. I advise the Prime Minister to aggressively fund and arm the remnants of the host nation's military to crush the insurgency.
Or direct intervention.
Exactly. Alternatively, I advocate for a coordinated NATO military intervention, airstrikes, and special forces to decapitate the group's leadership and destroy their training camps. Regarding the migrants, I view them primarily through a security paradigm. They are a potential vector for instability that must be contained through hardened border enforcement and naval blockades.
The classic muscular hardline response. Eliminate the physical capability of the threat. Okay, step out of the room, take a breath, and walk back in as a constructivist. The intelligence on the desk is the exact same. How does your briefing change?
The briefing changes radically because my definition of the threat has changed. I tell the Prime Minister that dropping bombs might destroy physical infrastructure, but it will absolutely fail to destroy the idea that fuels this insurgency.
Because it's an ideology.
Right. In fact, if a coalition of Western militaries begins bombing North Africa, we are playing directly into the terrorist group's narrative. We are validating their constructed identity of the West as a hostile, imperialist crusader, which will serve as their greatest recruitment tool.
Wow, so bombing actually makes us less secure in this view.
Exactly. My recommendation focuses on norms and ideology. I advise that we must counter the narrative. We need to invest heavily in diplomatic engagement, counter-radicalization programs, and economic support for local civil society organizations that provide an alternative, peaceful identity for disenfranchised youth.
And what about the migration crisis?
Well, I emphasize that how Denmark and the EU treat these refugees will define our normative identity on the global stage. If we militarize the border and abandon them, we erode the very liberal human rights norms that the EU claims as its foundational identity, fundamentally weakening our soft power globally.
Wow. Two completely divergent strategies, both deeply logical within their own paradigms. Let's do one more. Walk in as a post-colonialist.
As a post-colonialist, I tell the Prime Minister that we cannot manage this crisis without understanding how Europe's past created it. I explain that this terrorist group did not materialize out of thin air. They are capitalizing on deep, systemic resentments fueled by decades of economic exploitation and artificial borders drawn by European empires.
So the historical context is everything.
Everything. My recommendation is that any direct Western military intervention will immediately be viewed correctly by many locals as an act of neo-imperialism. I advise that the solution must be locally driven, not dictated by Christiansborg or Brussels. We must examine our own structural complicity.
Like trade policies.
Yeah, are European trade policies and agricultural subsidies destroying the local economy in that region, driving youth into radicalism? And on the issue of migration, I shift the moral framework entirely. I remind the Prime Minister that the vast wealth of Europe was built, in part, on the historical extraction of resources from the very regions these people are now fleeing.
Which completely flips the script on asylum.
It does. Therefore, offering asylum is not an act of optional charity. It is a structural, moral obligation grounded in historical debt.
You've just laid out three completely contradictory paths of action. One says bomb them, one says diffuse the narrative, and one says look at our own historical complicity. If I am the Prime Minister, how do I know which lens is the correct one to base a multi-billion-dollar life and death policy on?
That is the ultimate secret of the discipline. No single theory is the correct one. To believe that one paradigm holds the absolute truth is to deliberately blind yourself.
You need them all.
The most effective visionary policymakers are those who can synthesize multiple theories to expose their own blind spots. You use realism to understand and neutralize the immediate physical threat. You use constructivism to fight the ideological battle and maintain your soft power. And you use post-colonialism to understand the deep historical context, ensuring you don't repeat the arrogant mistakes of the past that fueled the resentment in the first place. A robust foreign policy requires the integration of all these perspectives.
That is incredibly illuminating. It clearly demonstrates that theory isn't just academic navel-gazing for professors. It is the literal framework that dictates the life and death policy decisions shaping our world.
Absolutely. And pulling all of this dense material together leads us directly into our key takeaways for this deep dive.
Let's synthesize this journey into three clear, actionable insights for you to take with you. Number one, theory is completely unavoidable. Whether you realize it or not, you are already using theory. When you watch the evening news and form an opinion about why a trade war started or why a ceasefire failed, you are implicitly applying a theoretical framework. The goal of studying IR is simply to become conscious of the filter you are using so it doesn't control you blindly.
Exactly. Which brings us to number two, highlighting different aspects. Each theory we discussed, from realism's cold focus on the mechanics of power and survival, to feminism's vital exposure of marginalized voices and invisible gender structures, illuminates a fundamentally different aspect of world politics.
Right.
None of them show the whole picture, but layered together, they provide a three-dimensional map of the international system.
And number three, conscious application. You can actively use these theories in your daily life. Whether you are studying for a political science degree, teaching a high school class, or just listening to your morning news briefing, try a mental exercise. Swap your glasses.
Just ask yourself, how would a Marxist read this headline about the supply chain?
Exactly. Or, what would a constructivist say about this new climate treaty? It is the single best intellectual habit to avoid being trapped in a narrow echo chamber perspective.
And if you want to keep practicing that conscious application and see how these grand theories apply directly to the regional dynamics of Northern Europe, we highly encourage you to join us on Patreon. The link is right there in the description. Your subscription is what allows us to keep producing these deep dives, and you'll gain access to our exclusive weekly and monthly briefings focused specifically on Danish politics. It's a fantastic way to watch these theories operate in real time within a specific geopolitical context.
We have a great community building there, and we'd love to have you be a part of it. Now, as we wrap up our time together, we always like to leave you with a final provocative thought to mull over.
Let's loop back to Thomas Kuhn and the concept of the paradigm shift. Kuhn noted that human beings once firmly, absolutely accepted the flat Earth and the geocentric universe as unquestionable scientific facts. The smartest minds of the era built institutions around those beliefs.
They thought they had it all figured out.
Exactly. Today, we accept the existence of the sovereign nation-state, the concept of national security, and the rigid international borders that divide our map as absolute, unquestionable facts of reality. But the theories we explore today remind us that these are just concepts we have socially agreed upon.
Right.
So the thought I leave you with is this. If our reality is constructed by the ideas we accept, What current absolute truths about our international system might future generations look back on as archaic, outdated, flat earth illusions?
What a phenomenal question to end on. Think about that the next time you look at a globe, it might just be a temporary draft of human organization. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. If you enjoyed the conversation and found these concepts helpful, please hit follow and rate the show 5 stars wherever you are listening. It truly is the #1 way to help the show reach more curious minds.
We read every review, and we appreciate your support immensely.
And you definitely won't want to miss our next deep dive in the summer series. We are going to take everything we've just learned about theory and apply it to an incredibly complex and fascinating realm: international law. Is it possible to have binding laws without a global police force to arrest the rule breakers? We are going to find out.
Until then, remember that the X-ray machine of global politics might be broken.
But if you know how to swap your lenses, the muddy waters of international relations start to make a whole lot of sense. See you next time.